Good afternoon and welcome to the Takeup. Today we have episode 207, The Essentials, Path Operations, Bezier, and Splines. Good afternoon, folks, and welcome into the Take-Up on this wonderful Friday afternoon. As you guys often introduce yourselves where you are and what the weather's like from cold, but not very cold, Albuquerque, New Mexico. We've got a little chill in the air, and we're certainly seeing something that looks a lot more like fall and leading into winter. However, what I would love to say is that it is always warm next to the embroidery machine as we warm the cockles of our hearts by looking over at our wonderful work and seeing what we've done. The thing is, that's not always where we're starting and not always where I get the questions. It's lovely when we get things into a stitched format and to start to see the fruits of our labor. But frankly, a lot of the questions I get come a lot earlier in the process where people want to talk about digitizing and the tools therein. And frankly, one of the ones that I've had more questions than I thought I would have had in recent months and recent weeks are in the realm of graphical operators. And we're going to talk about what that means in a moment. But if you're somebody who is in the Brilliance world, we're talking about something you see in Stitch Artist 3. If you're somebody in the Wilcom world, this is present. If you're a vector drawing person, then you're going to find something like this in Illustrator called Pathfinder. You will find all of these various path operations, graphical operators. These things are ways in which we use shapes to build other shapes, and we can subtract and add, and we'll talk about the terminology as far as that, where we composite these shapes together to get new vector shapes or to alter the shapes that we have. That's one of the things we're going to talk about today. I'm going to try and tour you through that and actually show you in multiple softwares, including a piece of vector software, kind of what it means and what it does and the things to watch out for. And I'm going to briefly show you in software, one of the things I find is troublesome with using path operations on things to get things done. But we're going to talk about what's available there and what that does for you, these ways to alter a path and what things are useful, are more and less useful as far as creating shapes for digitizing shapes for embroidery. And as we get to it, I'm probably going to keep this as a shorter show. I know I say that sometimes and I still go an hour and a half, but I'm going to try for the live today. We will probably talk a bit also about drawing and the different kinds of lines that we have. And this includes the big kind of deviation between two types of lines we can draw or edit in our software, or we might be familiar with coming from vector drawing software, those being a spline line, one in which a line approximates a curve through multiple points. And as we want to refine a curve or a shape, we add more points, and the type of point kind of tells you what the line will do as it comes into and exits that point or node. And then the other type is a Bezier curve, something that vector drawing folks are very readily understanding of. They have an understanding and a way of handling. These are nodes that, though they do have a type, whether it's a corner or a cusp or a curve node, and you may have 2 or 3 node combinations, different types of nodes. We'll talk about that. You have handles on that node that as you stretch these handles and tilt the handles, it causes the line to bend through that node or come from that node in a bent way differently. So we can alter the curvature of a line between 2 nodes by playing with those handles. And the differences are both in the way we enter these and the way we edit these. So it's like it's creation of a shape and editing. So I'm hoping we'll get to some of that too as we go through that process. But we're going to start off, like I said, with these graphical operators, or as I said here, path operations. As you see on the thumbnail here, those path operations, ways to take multiple paths, which are shapes. We have to remember that a shape is really just a open or closed line. When we're talking about a shape in whether it's vector software or in digitizing software, this is a line, a path that can either be closed, connect back to itself, or open. The two ends don't have to meet. But when we're talking about these path operations, they generally are with closed shapes. We have shapes that have a line that entirely encloses a space within. Generally, two or more of these shapes are put together, and then we can use some sort of operation on these shapes, a logical operation. We'll talk about them in a moment, to cut pieces out, add them together, and what have you. And then we get new shapes that are potentially useful for what we're doing in our digitizing embroidery and in our vector art creation. So we'll talk about those, and I'm going to keep this fairly simple. I've decided to do a few of these essential series pieces because people are saying that they can't find the specific information about some of these tools and want to have this distilled a little bit. Though I'm going to get back next week. I've got a couple of options for the show for next week. It may either be an interview show, or it may be a more project variant or style variant show where we talk about something that's a little more deep and detailed. Many people have said that it's hard to search through these shows to find exactly what they want as far as these niche topics. And I think this is actually a useful one to kind of explain this concept to folks, especially if you come to digitizing from embroidery, you come to this place without a lot of graphic design background. If you haven't worked in vector software very much, you didn't do a lot of drawing, then some of this stuff might seem weird. And frankly, going back and forth between different models. In fact, I'm going to show you more than one software suite here. The ways in which these path operations are used, how they're called, and what you have to pay attention to make them work the way you expect can be different. So we have to kind of look at that in general and say, hey, they are sometimes different. They don't always have the same options in every set of tools or every suite. And we have to look at what they do. And honestly, it's cool just to tour through and go, if I have two shapes and we do something with these two shapes with this path operation, with this graphical operator, what's going to happen? And I think we're just going to go through that. It's a good way to talk about that for a little bit. And then I'm going to give you some pros, cons, and a little bit from one of my classes about, like I said, spline versus Bezier. And we'll see how deeply we want to get into that today. But I think those are topics that are really kind of linked together. The concept of both shape building, and I mean that by using multiple shapes with path operations to get new shapes, and the concept of how we draw and what that affects as far as some of these processes as well, because how we draw and how many points we use and how careful we are with our vector lines that are essentially the basis of all, both vector art and digitizing embroidery, what those will do when we apply operations to them. Because there are other operations beside these logical operations, like expanding, making outlines, contracting, offsets, things like that can be affected with how we draw and how cleanly we draw sometimes. So we're going to talk about that stuff, but let's go ahead and grab some comments. You guys know that I like to talk to folks who are here live, but if you are not here live and you want to skip it, go on ahead. But when we have folks here live, we want to get that community together, and I like that community feeling. So I always like to say hi to everybody. First, we have Gail from Kingsbury saying, hello, Eric and the chatters. I'm listening today. Happy to have you in. Got B showing up saying, morning, everyone, from what will be a hot day in the Barossa Valley. Thank you for showing up, B. Got Scott showing in from Sunrise Tactical Gear saying, happy Friday, everyone, from the cold and damp central Washington State. See, I told you everybody gives us the weather report. I love it. Doug says, hi, everyone, from World Series champion Los Angeles Dodgers land. Hey, how's it going? I've got Barb coming in from Minnesota Custom Made saying, good afternoon. Brent's showing up from Minneapolis, Minnesota. Good to see you, Brent. Ron is in as well, and he's, as usual, accompanied by some coffee and other beverages. We will let that be to your imagination what might be in the rocks glass there. And lots of folks talking. So I guess it just started videoing out on YouTube, you just said. All right, Doug, hopefully you didn't have too much trouble there, sir. If there's some other problem with it, I'll check out the video. I am going to tell you this right now, folks. This is our last show on the StreamYard platform. You've heard me talk about StreamYard. We are moving to a new platform. That this is also other shows I'm on. Why I'm saying we is because if you've seen me on the Two Other Guys show, we're also moving to a new streaming platform there. So next week might be a little dicey with the new streaming platform, but here's hoping we have fewer problems with it and that we get a good result. So we're going to test that out next week, and we're going to see what happens. So hopefully that will tie up some of the problems we've had with StreamYard in the past, and we will get to try this new platform coming up next week. So lots of other folks talking. We'll have to see if anybody else is here. We have Doug saying it is 73 degrees and partly cloudy in Los Angeles. Like I said, always the weather. Mike's coming in saying, oh, hi, where you been? Oh, it's me that's been missing. Yeah, I try and be here fairly consistently, not perhaps as much as I should be, but still getting the work done. And then also he says 1 degree here, still t-shirt weather. So you say. So you say. But yeah, we're doing pretty good down here in New Mexico. It's cold for New Mexico, but what I always say about New Mexico cold is that though we do really get cold, most of us are not ready for it when it gets here. And certainly after having an unseasonably warm kind of start through October, we were not ready for the sudden snap right on Halloween. But suffice it to say, we actually have some business to do here. I love chatting with you guys, and I certainly welcome all comments, all questions. I would love it. First, I always tell you guys I will answer anything I can. But if you are on the topic of drawing for embroidery, of splines and vectors, so different line methods of how points and nodes work, of how these graphical operators work, I'm going to answer those first because that's what's on topic for today. I will try and answer other questions if I can. If not, we'll get back to them later, but we always like to see those comments and questions. So very happy to see you guys here. And let's get into it. Let's talk about some of this stuff. So like I said, graphical operators or path operations. What am I talking about here? Let's just get literally right into this. I don't think it has to be incredibly difficult. I think it is worthwhile for us to just go ahead and just talk about this in software. Like get this out, discuss what it looks like, discuss how different softwares do it a little bit, and just show you kind of what can come of these operations. I will go ahead and grab my pointer focus tool so I can let my mouse be a little more visible for you guys as we start working on this stuff. But let's go ahead and add into the stage our software and get stuff up on screen for you. So we have these graphical operators, right? And what you're going to notice when I pull up the image here is we have all these different options for all these little images here. What I've already done ahead of time is shown you the results of what happens with these graphical operators. Now, this is in Stitch Artist 3. That's what I'm working in here. I'm going to show you some other design stuff to kind of get things across as far as some other points further on. But right now, you're going to see this little set of shapes. But it's not just this software we're going to look at. I am going to briefly show you what that looks like as far as the operators available in Wilcom Embroidery Studio, just to show you the kind of the differences of what's there, and to show you that these are, though they are really available everywhere. And frankly, I'm going to show you some in Affinity Designer. So Affinity Designer is kind of a new lower cost and non-subscription, newish, couple years, vector software that a lot of people use lately. I also, by the way, it's in CorelDRAW. I didn't want to load up every piece of software I have. I've got multiple drawing softwares. This is one that runs nice and light and tends to do nicely on stream. And a lot of folks find it very accessible because the cost is low. So that's another reason I'm showing that. But we're just going to go through some of these operators. And like I said, I'm going to go ahead and start in Stitch Artist 3. But these operators are fairly simple to use, and I'm going to show you a couple of things that aren't the same and aren't always classified as those operators as we go. But just to show you the most basic versions, we're going to start here. And I think I might be able to go and throw myself into the corner so we can get this even bigger. You will miss something on the screen. I will zoom in on it later for the combination that I'm covering up with my head here shortly. However, what you're going to see here is that we have these two original shapes, and I'm just going to kind of show them to you and drag them out. These are imported from Vector. So if you see that this has a ton of junky points on it, absolutely it does. The reason being the original two shapes, I wanted them to be the same through all the different softwares. And the software I pulled them out of, it brought them out as what's called an EMF file. This is an old school vector format, very old school. It's all that it would export, and I had already made my initial run. So I'm using files that have some pretty junky point values. I mean, this is a crazy number of points and lots of hard node points that really shouldn't be there for these shapes. So don't judge me on these suckers. I used stock shapes just to make sure you could see that just grabbing stock shapes and slapping together would make this thing happen. But these are essentially the two shapes that we're working with, right? We have this red heart here. We have this kind of banner shape in green here. And these are the two shapes we're operating with. Now, depending on the software, you may find that like in Stitch Artist, it will take out your stitch settings when you do these processes because you are then expected to reapply stitch settings that make sense for these new shapes that you've made. So I've filled them in here just so you can see what happens. But what we're going to notice is up here in the corner, this is on the Stitch Artist 3 Create menu. These are the path tools, and you can kind of see path here. In fact, I believe I can give you a magnifier that makes this a little more clear. Here's our path tools, and we can see that we have various path tools that are here, right? We've got our and, we have our subtract, we have some other tools that are not part of this path set, and we have logical union, and these are things that are kind of easy to see here. So just kind of showing you these ones that exist as well as some of the others that are there, but this is our path menu, and that's where that's at if you're curious. But these same tools, like I said, they appear in multiple softwares in different places. I will say that my Wilcom instance kind of has all of the icons in multiple places right now. So what you're going to notice if I go over to that Wilcom instance, I haven't optimized my icons in a long time. But you're going to see the same path operations are up here at this point. That's not where they're always going to be because obviously these are tear off menus and you can move them wherever you need to. But there's another set of operators that are very similar: weld, intersect, exclude, front minus back, back minus front, flatten, divide, combine. But they are very, very similar tools. And in fact, like I said, also we have Affinity Designer here. And though they are not currently visible, I believe I have to do selections for that. Once the shapes are selected in Affinity Designer, we now have our add, subtract, intersect, or and divide. And we'll talk about what those do. Like I said, some of these functions are also very similar, what they actually do, but what they're called up here in whatever path function menu you have versus what they do, it might be different, right? That might be different. Also, depending on what pieces are in front and back. You already noticed when I said I was showing the Wilcom menu, they've decided to separate some of their elements where it depends on it actually will subtract front from back or back from front. Whereas other software like Stitch Artist 3, it assumes from your order what you want to happen to the design elements. But the thing to notice is you have multiple design elements, you're going to select them, and then when you click on one of these path operations, it's going to have an effect on these elements, right? So if we look at what we have here, we have the logical and it describes it. Luckily, when we're talking about Stitch Artist, it describes it for you when you hover over, recreates the object where it's overlapped. The subtract removes the area that's overlapped. We have the union, and the union is going to create objects that encompasses the entire area. And the reason you're seeing two kind of stripes of elements here to show you what's going on. I also have another piece down here that I'm going to mess with possibly later for other kind of discussions of tools. We have things like cut lines that are similar to all these processes about how we edit files. When we're looking at this piece, on this line for Stitch Artist 3, this is where we have the heart shape underneath our green stripe. That's how these functions are going to go. On this line, this is what happens when we have our heart shape on top of our green stripe. So what we can see is some of these functions differ depending on what's on top, because in Stitch Artist, it actually uses the order in which they are layered to dictate what's going to happen when you use these functions. So what happens is if we select these two elements here and we click our logical and, it's going to recreate an object where it's overlapped. And what that does is give us this object. What it is wherever these two shapes are overlapped, that's the object we're going to get. Now, one thing I'm going to mention that is different depending on the software you have or the settings that are set in your software, depending on which suite, you may have something that is destructive or non-destructive by default. What I mean by that is, particularly in Stitch Artist, the way we have it by default here, if you go ahead and do this logical and, you'll see that my original shapes are still there. My original shapes are still there, but when I grab this shape, now you'll notice there's my and. That's the shape that is created that encompasses the area where everything overlaps between those two shapes. But this is non-destructive. What does this mean? When we have these two shapes here, though I've done an operation on them, the two original shapes remain. Some software, you can turn that on and off. Some software, it is by the nature of the software, by default, what it's going to do. So some software, you will do this process and it will alter the shapes that are there and your original shapes are now gone. Or at least you're going to have to copy, paste, and do other things to maintain copies of your original shapes. Stitch Artist 3, it is a non-destructive process. It does not do anything to the original shapes you're working on. It just removes or adds or does any of the other processes on a new shape that is then produced. So like we've said here, that was our logical and. In this case, we have a logical subtract. If I click the logical subtract, you'll see we generally have that. The way I have it selected is different here. So we've got that done, and it makes this shape we have here. And if we have a union between the shapes, we can go ahead and set up a union, logical union, and the union will now make this new shape here. And this new shape is the entire outline of the border. So that's what we're saying in this piece. If we do the logical and, it means that anything that is overlapped becomes this new shape. If we have a logical subtract, anything that is outside, it subtracts one shape from the other, it subtracts the overlap. But what you're going to notice is here's our logical and. It's the same for these two sets because it's the same uh, element that we're working from as the base. But when this border shape is underneath the heart and we use a subtract, by default with Stitch Artist 3, you're going to have it subtract the top shape, the front shape from the back. So it's a back, rather, it's a back minus front. I said that incorrectly. The front, you will actually have the back shape remain and the front will be punched out of it. So in the case of using logical subtract on this set of shapes where the heart is behind, it's going to knock that banner out of the heart. In the case of this piece where the banner is behind it, it's going to knock the heart out of the banner. However, as with the logical and the union, which grafts everything together into one shape, and you can see it's one outline with no gaps within it. So if we zoom in tighter on that, it is one outline. There's no lines along inside here to show the original shapes that were there. That's going to be the same no matter what order you're overlapped in. And so that's how it works in Stitch Artist 3. There are other options for this. There are other ways this can work, but I wanted to kind of just show the ways that it can work and how it works in different software. So I'm going to show you what's going on in Wilcom. It does have some other options that are different. They largely end up with the same shapes, just sometimes in a different method or in less steps, depending on what they decided to do. Or like I said before, you can select sometimes with your subtraction either to back minus front or front minus back without changing the order of your objects. So these are all just different methods or different modes by which you work, but they have a very similar result either way. In essence, these are really ways to logically apply if I added these two together, what would be there? If I subtracted one from the other, what would be there? And honestly, that's really all it amounts to. Two shapes are either we're subtracting, we're adding, we're making them one fused outline, or we are taking pieces away. How do we use this? We sometimes use these to nibble pieces away from other pieces. We will sometimes use these to cut out voids for areas that we don't want stitched in a shape that we originally drew or took from print or vector art into our software. These can be useful, but they do have some drawbacks that I'm going to cover in a moment. Real quickly, I'm going to check comments, see who else we have here. It looks like nobody else is asking any harsh questions just yet. Mostly it's just everybody sharing their weather reports. So apparently Ron's 50 and sunny. We have Crystal saying hi. Hi, Crystal. And we have Lisa Shaw saying good afternoon. Good afternoon, Lisa. I know you've covered this fairly recently too. I've gotten similar questions. I didn't see it till later that I saw some folks talking about or your earlier coverage of this topic for sure. But yeah, and Candy says, thank you for the SA3 review and use options. Absolutely. No, I think, like I said, and I'll bring these back up. It's not that it is tremendously different in the other software. The functions are very similar, but I am going to talk about kind of how they get used and what people are, what they're using them for and what I don't think they're all that great at. Because the one thing I'll say about this is you can sometimes create shapes that don't fill very well with stitches. And I'll show you that on an actual example in a moment. But before I do, I will go ahead and just review other software just to show you what other software is doing. It doesn't have to be in one software or another to be viable. I'm going to kind of pull myself out of the way here. The difference here with Wilcom shapes, these are exactly the same shapes and vectors. So these are exactly what you saw before. We've got our banner and our heart. The big differences are, number one, the terminology, where we would have union in Stitch Artist 3. Wilcom has weld. Similar style, really isn't much different. So it makes the same result. If you see me in Stitch Artist, the union shape is exactly the same here that we would have over in Wilcom as the weld shape. Also, kind of literally the order in your toolbar is different, obviously, and just the way these are called. So we're looking at this piece here. That was our logical and from Stitch Artist 3. Logical and in this case is called intersect on Wilcom. Absolutely the same shape. No difference functionally in that shape. What we do have that's a little bit different is where we're looking at what we do in Stitch Artist. You don't have this kind of combination of both the front and back subtraction where we just subtract out the element that's there. We do knock away the whatever element we are using to punch out also goes away. Like if you punch that banner through, it goes away, and we don't have an extra piece on there. Whereas we do have some operators that are a little different in Wilcom, where as you saw, we go through this exclude. Exclude is like that. It's like if we punch these designs out of each other, what would there be? And so we exclude the overlapped area, and that's this version. Exclude just punches out the area that was like our logical and, or, which I believe, once again, they call intersect here. The other one that's a little strange, I don't always know why you would do this necessarily, or I haven't used it as much. We have this divide, I believe. Yeah. So we have a divide option, and the divide option allows things to still remain there. So it cuts all the lines out of each other's shape. So the lines from the banner are cut out of the heart. The lines from the heart are cut out of the banner. Essentially, that's kind of what's happening. We're having that division. So it does that. There is the combine, which is down here. And that just means that we've got these shapes. Again, it's very much the same as what's going on in other elements. One of the other ones that might be a little more interesting. Here's our front minus back, back minus front. As you can see with the front minus back, back minus front. So this one is back minus front over here. So front minus back, I think. I did it incorrectly again. Yeah, we did that. Yeah, so that's front minus back. So in this case, what you're really looking at, if we look at Stitch Artist, the same thing's happening. It just, in Stitch Artist, the way that it's determined is whether or not these pieces are in front or behind in the object order, in the object tree. Whereas the difference in Wilcom is just one of method. You can use a button to say, yeah, I want to take the front piece out of the back or the back piece out of the front. And I say it incorrectly all the time. I apologize. It's a little easier to do it while I've got it all selected rather than kind of talk about it after the fact. The one different option here is the flatten option. And the flatten option that we have here does this, where it just kind of knocks the area out behind it, but it reserves the shape that was there. So instead of just subtracting, it just reserves the shape. If you have a non-destructive subtract, that's the same kind of thing. But ultimately, if you look at this, if you were to copy and paste shapes or to move your sequencing, nothing that happens here is actually different from anything that happens here. It's really about the method more than it is about what functionally happens. It's about kind of the mode and the way it's discussed more than it necessarily is about functionality. And in fact, that's pretty much the same when we're in vector software. And in this case, we're looking at Affinity. So here in Affinity, these very same vector shapes, I exported them directly out of digitizing software to get there. You can see we have our add, our subtract, our intersect, our or, and our divide. And here's our add, which is our union in Stitch Artist 3. I believe we've got our subtract here, which knocks that out. So we're knocking the front from the back. So the back minus the front is what's going on here. We have our intersect, which is essentially our logical and wherever the two shapes intersect. And then we have, of course, the or. So and or means the shapes that don't intersect. So it knocks away the intersecting space. And then, of course, we have our divide, and divide does much what divide does in Wilcom. So the funny thing is, we actually have kind of a mix of the two metaphors here in Affinity. The thing that's interesting about this, honestly, for me, is just saying that you can use one shape to knock something out of another shape. Why would I do this for digitizing? Kind of why I showed you this with this banner is I have, and I know that I have done such a thing where I'm saying, all right, I'm putting a big filled banner on top of this heart, but I really don't want that banner to be stitched under there. And I have nice big satin stitch borders that are eventually going to go over this banner. And I just want to knock the one shape out of the other for a big filled object. When it's something like that, and I don't have any complex, tight, acute corners or any real rough shapes, then it's all right. If I start to go in here and I have, let's say, like a silhouette of trees on a mountain, and that's going to be knocked out, I'm trying to knock that out of a fill, that's a terrible idea. I don't want to have a complex fill that I then knock out a very intricate, like a snowflake pattern out of that thing and try and leave a gap that has tons of little branches and holes inside of it. That's going to cause trouble. Most of the time, it's something like this. It's graphical logo work where I'm trying to knock a big shape out of another shape. And then I might even refine those shapes further, drag back some lines. Maybe this is too close of an overlap. Maybe I'm going to select some of the points here and move them or drag them back. Now I just messed with my Bezier because I can't get close enough on my streaming software to see what I'm doing. Yeah, I mean, you may then do some editing. This kind of big alteration with simple shapes usually works pretty nicely, can be done well. We can do things to get nice borders. We can also, the other thing I'll do with this is use sacrificial shapes. So let's say I wanted to make this shape have multiple colors and I have specific little stripes that I'm trying to do it in. I will either use cut lines or maybe I have a weird couple different angles that I want to cut this at. I might make a sacrificial shape and then use that sacrificial shape to subtract out or punch something out of this shape that is easier to do than trying to edit the original. You know, it might be something where if I have a really easy way to punch a chunk out of a shape and I don't want to draw everything that's there, maybe it's easier to do that than do a cut line or to edit. And especially if we're talking about something like, let's say I'm trying to achieve a really nice inverse curve in this thing. Maybe I convert this to a smooth point. This is more cusp style. And I'm trying to make this really round and to fit some circular object that it's supposed to tuck into for some logo. Maybe the heart has like a golf ball sticking under it for somebody's golf logo. And I'm drawing and pulling on these points and it's not looking really great. I might decide instead to grab the object, the circle that's going to define this later, whatever golf ball shape here. And I might decide then to take that circle, grab this piece. We'll go ahead and make this a color so we can see what we're doing. Doesn't matter what. Grab this, and maybe I'm going to go ahead and subtract it or punch that out. And now it's a little easier to work with. However, this is where we get into the issue with digitizing. I'm doing this in vector software right now, but where if we're looking at this piece and this was, let's say, a horizontal fill, I now have these really teeny tiny points that I'm going down to. And any complex fill is going to try and fill those with little bitty stitches that might not be as attractive as if I had done my manual work here. And maybe I'll still have to go back and do this where I crop off these little points and make straight lines that match with my, you know, that match with my existing stitch angle. So I don't have tons of little tiny stitches generating. And let me show you that in a more reasonable fashion. Let's actually go into digitizing software to do that. Here we are in Stitch Artist 3, and I'm just going to show you, I have kind of a faux conversion that I did of a piece of vector art. This is from a piece of vector art I did of a raven skull. If you want to see the original, I actually drew the art by hand off of this image, this kind of sample, this biological kind of catalog sample of a raven skull, and I drew this image from that originally, refined it several times through Sketch, but this became a vector. And part of it is digitized and part of it is shape built. And here's where I want to show you just a little bit of what I'm talking about. Now, this is not refined or done in a fantastic way, but you can see this shape right here. So this is converted directly from vector. And how would I get this kind of moon-like shape? Well, let's say you're trying to make a shape like that and you were drawing this vector for yourself and you don't want to really draw it. You might say, all right, I've got this circle right here. And I may not do the best job of this. As we always know, when I'm streaming, it doesn't always respond as quickly as I would like. But let's get my shape back here. Let's see if I can actually select my shape and be there. All right. So let's get my circle here. And I say, all right, I've got the outside circle that's about that shape. And then maybe I want to go ahead and copy that. And I'm going to paste it. And then I'll grab those two and say, well, this isn't quite right. I'll go ahead and move this over to here. I'm going to stretch that out until it's about the right shape. Then I take those two lines that I have now, provided I can get them both selected at the same time while everything's running real slow. And by the way, not a software problem. This is definitely a streaming problem. This is what I'm hoping from our new software will give us a bit better options for this stuff and not be quite so slow in the response time. Here, I'm going to grab this out of here, even though it's not going to be exactly where I had it before. And it's going to take with it more than I want. Let's get rid of these. Here's our two shapes. That's what I was working for. So here's our two shapes, and I've now overlapped those. And I'm like, all right, well, if I'm going to do that, then let's say, what am I going to try and do here? I need to subtract those, and now I've got my shape. So I didn't have to go in and draw, because the other option to do that was, of course, to then go through this and say, let's say I'm drawing, and depending on the type of drawing I'm doing, here I am drawing with points, and I've got this, and I'm going to want like I don't want a cusp point here and a curve point here, and I'm going to lock this back down with a cusp. And then, well, it didn't quite go. So now I've got to edit this. I'm going to pull this point around here to get it perfect. And maybe I didn't quite get this curved correctly. And it can be more work to do that. So people think they're going to use this shape and just kind of work with that as far as cutting it out of the two circles. That can be useful. The thing you're going to find though is, let's say, depending on what we're filling this with, I mean, a satin stitch, not a huge problem, but and if we're working on the satin stitch and generally, let's say we're kind of doing a very small amount of turning in the satin, what you might notice is toward the ends, we have kind of some odd things that can happen with stitches as we try and fill and the angle doesn't match, and we might have curvature that sticks kind of out below the last couple points that would have been here, and we get just some density or some weird stuff that can sometimes happen in these points. It's not necessarily a bad thing all the time, but you can see that there's a little excess density or a little weirdness. Now, I'm just going to show you one that's already been cropped down. If we look at this shape, this kind of arc that's on the top of this brow bone kind of thing here, what we can see about this shape is this piece was made and digitized for a satin stitch. We go down here and I've ended it in a chisel tip that I made to be the last stitch of a satin stitch. We all know satin stitches all have to end in a flat stitch. Pardon me from zipping around here, but we have to end in a stitch. We have to start in a stitch that's going to match that stitch angle and then move around. And you can see no weird densities. I mean, a little bit of difference because of turning the angle, but we don't have any weird densities. We don't have any stitches trying to fill down into teeny tiny points. Whereas if we can take this, even if we take this shape, and let's say I eliminate one of those points and make it a single point at the end of this, even if we just go ahead and grab this and then take our Bezier curve and make it that same kind of curvature that we would have had, would we have chopped that piece out instead? You can see that it will be a little bit different, a little bit harder to work with. Provided, like I said, provided that StreamYard will let me do this. I can hear my graphics card just chugging over there. But yeah, if we look down here now, I had that single point that would have been there if I had cut that out of an oval from the other shape. And it comes down to some small stitches. These are probably going to get filtered out, but I don't have as much control over them. There might be some little weird density, and I might have a lot of underlay that's trying to go into that end, depending on how those offsets are put together. Whereas knowing what the size and shape is and the overall scale, I have decided to crop off those ends as you would with a satin stitch usually. Whereas, as you can see, there's some other converted shapes over here. Here's another one where we've got a weird turn in the shape. Now, do I need to mess with stitch angles on this? This is made from, once again, converted vector instead of being done in any kind of real smart way. That converted vector doesn't have everything turning the way it should. We can lay that angle down into that shape, but really the right answer for something like this, where we're coming down to too sharp of a point in the original vector that was done with those sacrificial shapes, is to go ahead and pull something over like this and then give ourselves a line item at the end. And if we have a line segment, then it's going to come down to a single satin stitch, and we can play with how wide we want that to be. We can play with how far we want that to lay down into the angle in order to get a thinner representation of the satin. But as we do that, we have a little bit more control over it, and we do get something that looks more like a satin stitch should look, and probably won't give us any sort of weird generation of tiny little stitches. Not going to happen the same in every software in the same way, but I find that some of the conversions are worth it and some of them are not. Smashing big shapes out of another shape works pretty well. Like I said, you've got a big banner over a giant fill and you want to smash that out of there and then work with these simple shapes that are left over. Not going to be problematic for you. The more detailed a shape is that we start to smash those out of those, delete pieces out of it, stuff like that, the more likely we can have some weird things occur from that. Certainly other things can happen depending on shape quality, and that's something we're going to talk about if we talk a little bit about spline drawing and other stuff as we go on further. But we can get some weirdness with shapes that are cropped out like that when we do other processes to them, when we fill them, stuff like that too. So it really just kind of depends what we're working on and the complexity of the shape that we're trying to alter. Like I said, I don't always love using it for everything, but these path operators can be a big deal depending on what you're trying to get done. And certainly can be worthwhile for these large, quick alterations. Now, there's other stuff we can do too. That's not just these path operations as far as shape building or separating shapes or dividing shapes. Anything from, depending on your software, from automatic knife tools or drawn knife tools to StitchArts 3 has break lines that you can put in, and then you can use break line operations to cut a design at a break line. Those things are all possible to do. And I think that's worth looking at. We just have to be clear that no matter how we're drawing a shape, whether we're running in there and drawing it with points, whether we're walking in there with our existing vector and then editing it, or we're using our shape tools, that we think about the embroidery when we do it. We have to remember that creating shapes is not never the end of this thing. And we're not creating shapes for print. We're not creating shapes for cut lines for like vinyl or for heat press. We're creating the shapes for embroidery, and they have to be the kind of shapes that embroidery stitches can fill readily. Though I am glad to see I'm not the only one who does use these, and that other people asking this question might have some good company. Got Justin from JA Digitizing Studios and from Embroidery Nerd saying, "Ha, using this tool in the design I'm digitizing as you're talking about it." If you want to tell us what you're doing with it, I'd love to know. I mean, like I said, a lot of what I've done is to knock out areas from larger filled pieces, especially when I have nice, big, simple shapes, which are pretty common in logos and badges and stuff like that. Nice, big, simple shapes where I want to have two different, let's say, areas filled with two different stitch types or angles. And maybe I've got those two shapes there, but I want to knock out that excess so I'm not running in between or not running things on top of each other that don't need to be. Then I'll use something like that. What I will make clear, though, and let's talk about this really quickly. When we're talking about like division, and I think I'm going to try and bring up an example again. If I can give you guys back the example of like that division setup, just to show you. I'm going to show you in vector software, actually, just as a little easier for me to do so at the moment. I just want to show you so it's really nice and clear what I'm talking about. If we're doing something like this division just with filled areas and we don't have borders and we're not altering them. The other thing to remember, though, is when you do a direct cut like this, when we smash one design element out of another, we're going to have the kind of lines that if we add fills to them, the distortion's not going to be compensated necessarily, right? So first, let's just show you what I'm talking about as far as division and what I mean by these being perfect lines. Well, we'll do this in Affinity first, just show you real clear lines to kind of work from. But if we zoom in on this piece here, we take a look at this piece where we have that division done to it, we can see that these lines are a perfect cut, meaning that they are exactly on the edge. There is no overlap, and there's really no overlap intended by these pieces. They're meant to be an exact cut right to the line. If we think about that for a moment, you guys have been around long enough and you've been in embroidery long enough, I believe, if you're watching this episode, to understand that distortion is always going to happen. If I go ahead and make vertical fills on both of these suckers, now I wouldn't do that. I would be using two different fill styles. But let's say we're filling these with two different sets of stitches. And for the sake of argument, we're using a vertical fill on this heart. What's going to happen when I stitch this thing? Well, it's going to do this. The heart is going to shrink up in the angle of the stitching. It's going to pull for pull distortion. And let's say I did the same thing with the banner for whatever reason. Well, it's not going to be exactly like this. It's not going to shrink top and bottom there, but it'll probably go even further. And we're going to end up with gapping. Why? Because if the angle was vertical on all of these, it's going to draw down. It's going to draw down that angle. It's going to shrink in the angle of the stitch angle. If the stitches were all vertical, that's what's going to happen. So if we use this to just slap together, like let's say two big filled objects, which sometimes folks want to do, you're going to find that these things want to separate on you. Or you might have where if these horizontal setups were done, let's say we do this with horizontal stitch type or horizontal fill, well, then it's going to get narrower. And let's say this was done vertical, well, it's going to pull out between there, here and here. Now we might get a little bit of push on the other side from this guy, but there's a distinct possibility we can have some gapping, some distortion, because it's not set up for embroidery, right? Now I'm doing it in a way that's not exactly how it'll happen on the machine. But if we just absolutely blow this thing out, chop chunks out of it, and don't have any other editing in this process, we're very likely to see those same problems we have with converting vectors and doing a very similar job. Is that a lot of the time for print, you will have things that are layered exactly together. And if they're done for things like cut vinyl, they are very specifically layered that way. I mean, you may see them exactly kiss cut right to the line if we're trying to have these elements laid out for cut vinyl or heat press. you might not see a lot of overlap, especially if you get something from like a sign shop. I know it's old school, but I have worked with that stuff before where people bring you sign shop vinyl cut art. And you'll find that if it is in this presentation, it's already been flattened where we have that kiss cut line. Well, if I try and just convert that directly to embroidery shapes, you guys know I've fought against that a million times and said, don't do it, or at least that you have to be more careful about it. Then when I convert these into embroidery, what's going to happen is we're going to have shapes that don't necessarily do us any favors. If we line those shapes up exactly together, let's say we take our and our subtraction here, and we line these up exactly how they are. We go ahead and get those in the same plane as they would be if they were lined up together. We're going to see immediately that if I zoom these in now, I guess it didn't line up. I must have moved these in the process of messing with them. But let's say we just have these lined up the way they would be. We can put the vectors all together. Yes, it's all edge to edge, and that might look fine. Let's put this on top of this guy here so that it's a little more reasonable how you might do it. What we can see is maybe between the push and the pull, maybe this pushes up into this enough. Maybe it's enough that the pull on this piece, when it goes narrower, doesn't kill it. But the high chance of this, if we tried to make this as an embroidery with no more editing, certainly we're going to see the heart draw in on the sides, and we're going to see some expansion toward the tops of this heart. So it's going to be a little pointier up at the tips. Same thing down here. And we're going to see that this kind of combined split satiny kind of look that we have going on between this zigzag. I don't know why it's got a zigzag fill in it right now, a zigzag pattern. I must have accidentally clicked that. And a nice edge pad that's giving it that satin-like edge. The chances are that's going to really pull in pretty hard and we're going to get some gaps. So the chances are, even if I do that to this piece, if I'm not running another border, let's say, I mean, if I'm doing something where there's a border on this, if I imagine that I then have some sort of satin border that's thicker because I'm making some sort of border element, I assume a lot thinner than what we're seeing there. That's the default. Let's just imagine I'm adding some sort of border element on this, and that maybe I'm adding some other borders on this. Then that's going to cover up all your sins. You know, you're not going to see any of it. And between the two, if the border has enough overlap, maybe that's not a problem for you. And for a lot of the stuff I'm doing where this would have been the complete banner over the top, it's highly likely that there is some sort of border element on that for a logo style piece or a seal or an award or something where I might do this kind of knocking a big banner out of a shape. But we have to realize that when we use these graphical operators, if it's not a sacrificial shape being used to knock something out, like I did for the kind of half moon shape here, where we're just using that sacrificial shape to push that area out of the design without having to draw. If it's not something like that, then you will end up with those super tight kind of kiss cut right on the line shapes that will then kind of require you to do some other work to make them feasible as an embroidered final element. You know, you may not have those work out as far as you would want them to working with them as is. You're probably going to have to do some editing for pull compensation, push compensation, and any other sorts of problems that occur. And this is me just showing you the absolute simplest shapes. If I start taking really crazy hand-drawn shapes and punching them out of these things, we may not love what we end up with on the other end of that. And frankly, if we think about trying to fill any super complex shape, especially people like to bring in these very organic vectors. Me using the example of a forest of trees as a silhouette behind something is not a random example. I've seen it a million times where people want to do wildlife style designs. And one of the things they'll do is bring in an incredibly detailed silhouette and then slam that fill button. And what they end up with is a mishmash of elements in the background. And often what they have is malformed underlays, tons of stitching in small areas, really small stitches, and a tortured path through the fill because it's trying to fill all these little bitty areas as we move from the start point to the end point to the shape. So there are things you don't want to do. You don't want to punch super detailed pieces out of something. You don't want to punch lettering out of a fill. Small satin stitch lettering, even larger satin stitch lettering, especially small stuff, though, is where I see this. And it's really frustrating. People want to have a single layer of embroidery. They punch teeny tiny letters out of a fill, and it looks terrible. The fill doesn't fill in behind the lettering, and we have that same issue of it being this exact cut. And even though there's some push or pull compensation in the lettering, there's just not enough to make up for this stuff. Plus, you actually end up with a higher stitch count from all of the traveling stitches that have to happen to fill in all of the little voids and elements and little peninsulas of fill that end up cut out or left behind when you cut out lettering or something that's really complex. So the thing to avoid with this stuff, don't punch really complex shapes out of each other with subtract. Be careful when you're being additive with pieces and you're unioning something that's super complex too. And just be aware of embroidery in this process. It's the same thing when you're importing vector. If we lose the awareness of how embroidery elements work, if we don't think about the fact that just because an area is continuously filled with one color, that it does not have to be one object, and most of the time shouldn't be in embroidery. If you're doing it with any kind of detail or any kind of texture that's going on, you're trying to do something that makes sense of the stitches also. When we have small, sub few millimeter lines and borders, doing those out of a fill stitch that's all in one angle makes no sense. We want to use turning satins. We want to use satin stitches for small cylindrical or rectangular objects that are small enough to make sense for it. Certainly we can use different textures and different fills and things to make that happen. But there are tons of times where I'm seeing people use these kinds of subtraction tools to take a logo that has a slab of color and a bunch of text and borders around it and punch them all out of each other flat and then make all of the different colors out of one angle of fill stitch. And that is not taking into account what areas make the right sense for the right stitch types, literally the shapes and the spaces and the size of the elements, and not taking into account whatsoever the kind of distortion that is natural to embroidery, the push and the pull compensation that need to be applied in order for stitches to do what they do. All stitches, it's not like you guys haven't heard this if you've been around embroidery at all, but all stitches, they get shorter in the length, the angle of the stitch. So stitch from here to here, it's always going to get a little bit shorter under tension. If we stack a bunch of stitches together, we're always going to push a little out perpendicular to stitch angle. If all of my stitches were going horizontal, they're all going to be a little taller. A vertical column will be taller in satins always than it is on screen. We're going to push out, we're going to pull in, and that's going to happen forever. Like that is just going to happen with embroidery. That's the way the embroidery machines works. It's physically how embroidery works. And when we're punching elements out of each other in a way that's meant for ink, in a way that's meant for cut vinyl, in a way that's meant for digital representations, which honestly, they're usually not cut out from each other. Things are just slabbed on top of each other because what's visible is all that's important for digital. That doesn't take into account what embroidery is. So are paths useful? Are path operations useful? Absolutely they are. Why would you bother cutting that out on a simple design, especially a large piece that's not complex, on something like this where you're just punching a chunk out from a background element so that you can run something else on top of it? Absolutely great. Why not punch it out of there? It's not going to cause you any trouble. It's not super complicated, even though these have too many points from the original folks who drew the stock for these, way too many points in the way it exported. Still, this is not going to cause you any massive trouble. So punching out something like this, great option. Doing something super, super detailed, as long as it makes sense for the embroidery stitch, the type, the object, and the tool that you're using for the objects that you're using, right? The more complicated it is, the more likely that you're going to have trouble. It's just what it is. The more complicated, the more angles, the more curves, the more points that are in your piece, the more likely I think you are going to wish you hadn't punched them out. You're going to be more likely to want to make whatever complicated object that you're trying to create out of multiple individual pieces of stitch work. You're going to want to have those lines not be out of one big punched out fill. And that's not something I'm saying if. It's not an if, it's a yes. It's a when. If you make something super complicated out of a punched out lace-like fill stitch, you will wish you had cut that apart into other objects instead once you get it on the machine. And that's kind of software independent, though some software is better than others with plotting, traveling, and things like that. Software independent, you do not want a massive, detailed piece made out of a flattened out, complicated fill stitch. Just not the right way to roll. However, there's other cool things we can do, and I'm just going to show you a couple of them that are in Stitch Artist, but they are in other softwares, but the tools are sometimes separated from the path operation, so I'm going to kind of stick with Stitch Artist first. Other things that are very useful and I think are worth looking at. We also have those break line operators. Those are fantastic, and things like object inflation kind of is like a path. It is a path, tool, but it's not always really styled that way. You will find this also used as simple offsets or complex offsets in Wilcom. Here we have our shape inflation, and it's really something that's done on shapes, and it makes them into it's a vector thing that you're doing more than anything else. But you can get different options for the inflation here. You can inflate or deflate a piece. And this is where we're going to work on the path and say, all right, we want to put a contour outside of it. And in this case, it is, in this case, when I'm rounding the corners, it will soften them. If I take off the corner softening, it will maintain hard corners on an element. And we can set an amount we want to move from that element and then create something larger. And we see in this case, we have reserved our stitch type here, but you'll see that it has expanded it from the shape that we have. Now, though it was kind of a lot of points in that shape, because the shape was pretty geometrically clean, the natural process of making these vectors, the processes behind the scene, did clean that up into a slightly less point-ridden mess than it was as the original EMF file that I had to take it from. But you can see that is a tremendously useful thing. Because if I was trying to add a border and I want that border to be a little bit offset outside of this piece, I could very easily copy and paste this thing. I could create some other stitch type. I could use some other border type and then say, all right, I want this to be a little more extended out of this piece. I can add myself a millimeter to that piece, take off the softened corners, say, okay. And now I've created a border that's outside of the original piece and does not line up exactly with that piece that's there. Or if I wanted something even further out, obviously I can copy, paste, do the same thing. Maybe it's a border, doesn't really matter for this process, but I can then make a border outside of this piece entirely and create that very quickly. Those are also path style operations that are worth knowing. They're very good for making borders, even multiple borders. Then we can copy and paste and use multiple copies of this thing to make multicolored borders or to add different stitch types on this. In this case, let's say I grab that original, I copy that, I paste it in place, I add, I can add a different stitch type on top. And maybe if I just wanted like a straight stitch on top of a column, something like that, it's really easy. But let's say I want it on the inside of that line. Well, I can go back to my inflate, but use it as a deflation tool, back it up a little bit from the line that I was just on, take off my corner softening and say boom, and I'm actually now on the inside edge of that satin line, probably a little too far inside, but I didn't measure that before I tapped it out. But you can see now, and I'll go ahead and make that a different color, that we can essentially go ahead and quickly change out and add different stitch treatments to something. You'll also see this done, like I said, Wilcom has the complex offsets and simple offsets, does the same thing in a more programmatic fashion as far as the way it's laid out in the tools. I'm not going to cover all of those, but it is another way that we can kind of use path operations to do something very useful, right? So that is a very useful thing we can do to paths that are there. We want to make sure our paths are fairly clean. You're going to find that if you have something weird about your path, and let me maybe see if I can introduce some weirdness in this path. And I don't know. The funny thing is I'm so against trying to make a path break that it's going to feel real wrong to do it. But let's say I do something weird that introduces a problem. I have some reverse stitches. You'll see there's some weird generation that can happen with that. But let's say even if I make it small enough that the generation's not visible, but then I go and try to do like a massive inflation on that piece, you might see weirdness. It looks like it's just going to clean it out. In this case, it's not going to have much of an effort. Luckily, the way that these things are made, most of those small errors are not going to come up. But you might see some weirdness, like you saw this in that weird generation, because I've reversed the points in a place that doesn't make sense. That there's no room for those stitches to generate. So that's more about cleanliness of drawing, but you can see that happen when you're importing crappy vector, and I'll just say it, a poor vector, fonts that have poor generation, that aren't drawn very well, things that are auto-traced from old school auto-trace softwares can sometimes cause weird panics in software because they're made so poorly that they have shapes or hidden lines in them that cause generation to get weird. Depends on your software, depends on your object. Obviously, you saw there the inflation routine handled that very well and actually did not let me down. It didn't do any weird generation. I thought for sure I might get something out of it by messing it up, but no, didn't happen. Sometimes it will. You can sometimes see when you're doing inflation or deflation and the Bezier curves are weird, where you will get reversions where a line will try and make loops inside of it or something. And it's because we've got a curvature that's in the line that's not supposed to be there, or a handle that is flipped or twisted on a Bezier curve, which we will talk about in a second as we talk briefly about splines and curves. But other thing I just want to kind of bring up very quickly, you can also do things like adding break lines to shapes. Other software may have knife tool where you can draw a line and then it will cut a shape. In this case, I'm just going to show you a break line. This is where we can add a break line to a piece, and I'm just adding a simple one rather than trying to do something particularly fancy. But let's say I was trying to cut this piece off. I can add a break line to this piece, and then with this piece selected, I do have the ability to use the break line tool that is going to cut the object at the break line. And when I cut it, now I've got two objects, and I have the break line object, and I have the original object from the piece that we had there previously. So that can be used so we can add these break lines and cut things that are existing, and it makes it sometimes easier when we're trying to parse an object out. But as you saw, once again, I'll go ahead and put that break line piece back in. If we go ahead and do that and we cut an object with that break line, again, we're going to have that perfect cut line. And if we have the same stitch angles, obviously, pull will make gaps. There are no overlaps remaining when you cut something at a break line. So again, it can be useful for, let's say we wanted to have the top of this heart in one color and the bottom of the heart in another color. Very easy to snap that in half with a break line. But remember, once again, it's stitches. You're still going to have the same distortions you might have any other time. And if we have two colors that line up in the same angle and do push together or overlap correctly, you may have some blending of the two colors, some fall in at the line. So you might want to change your stitch angles a little bit to let them not fall in together, as you would with any two colors placed together in a standard fill. But suffice it to say, path operations, they're useful. They're good to use for, like I said, simple offsets, making borders on things, slamming a big chunk of area out of a filled object where we want to reduce layering and we're trying to drop another filled object inside of it, like a banner over a shape. I can't tell you how many seals have a larger colored circle with a banner through them. Lots of logos do that, and you may decide just to use the original drawings to make those big, simple, especially when you have like a satin bordered, dead simple shape. It is a lovely way to cut those apart and have those break apart easily without having to do a bunch of drawing and reworking of those shapes. When it's something complicated, I don't recommend it. I would say most of the time, if you've got a really complicated shape, first thing to look at is, do I need to knock fill out from behind it if it's satins or straight stitches or any sort of detail that's on there? We're not going more than a couple layers deep. Don't cut that stuff out. Most of the time, it's not worth it. Up to 3 and sometimes more layers of stitching may lay together okay if we don't have tons of stitch penetration points right in the same spot. It is more about just being conscious of where the needles are falling and how much we're building that up. But trying to cut little voids for stuff to drop into is usually a bad idea for most couple of layer designs. I mean, like I said, if you look back behind me and you see like this quarter horse design with text around that border, I'm not cutting anything out behind that text, even on that large jacket. I'm not cutting that out behind that satin stitch text. There's really no good reason for it until we get pretty large. And even then, a complicated enough shape where I'm filling in all the voids that are left behind can add stitch count. Even though it seems like you're cutting stitches out, all the travel stitching it takes to get into those voids can cause more stitch count in the final piece. So you need to look at what you're doing when you cut stuff out and see if you're really saving yourself anything. If you're trying to stop from building up bulk, there are reasons to cut stuff out, not usually behind small satin stitch lettering, which is where I constantly see people misuse that file. So don't punch letters out of fills. In general, just not a great idea, especially teeny tiny ones. They just don't look good. Even if you're trying to have you want to have color show through, don't. Match the small lettering thread to the color of the background and stitch that small lettering in. You will always be happier with the cleanliness than trying to punch it out of a fill. Just don't do it. I'll just go out on a limb and say, don't do that. Stop it. Get some help. Don't do that stuff. It's not good for you. It's not good for the embroidery. So let's go ahead and go very quickly. I don't want to take a long time on this one because we've done this in a more detailed way, but somebody asked me very briefly to cover just a little bit about spline versus Bezier. So these are two ways of drawing. They are called different things depending on the software you're in, but I'm going to use these terms because they're fairly universal as far as how we draw and edit shapes. So we're going to do this pretty shortly. I'm not going to take a long time on this one. At least I'm going to try and keep this tight because frankly, it's both a larger and a smaller subject than it could be, right? It is both too large to do in 30 minutes. And also I can give you the basics of what you really need to know probably very quickly as far as how they work and what the kind of pros and cons are without belaboring it. Are they very different? Yes, spline and Bezier are quite different as far as how they function when you're drawing, but the resulting shapes aren't that different. And more to the point, lots of folks are drawing with spline and then editing in Bezier, where it's like we're drawing with a spline tool, but then we are using handles to edit the line because it has a lot more fine control. That's pretty normal. And frankly, not something to avoid. If you want to try that, you can. And lots of people I know don't love working in Bezier if they're not used to vector tools. They want to work in spline all the time, and that's also possible and useful. But honestly, for me, most of the time, I'm doing kind of a hybrid method where I draw like I'm using Bezier, but I often have spline tools on. It's something you can do in different ways. It's really about whether you are estimating the curve and then working it back out, or if you want to control every moment of using that, of like drawing that curve and showing how the line is springing through all these nodes that we draw, these points. So spline versus Bezier, there's a lot of different ways we can handle that, but I'm going to actually bring up the topic out of a class that I've taught. So hopefully you guys will be okay with me going to some slides real quick. But I'm going to go ahead and sorry, I didn't throw my view onto presentation before we got here. Sorry about that, folks. But we do have spline versus Bezier. I'm just going to show you on the left-hand side, this is a spline line. So what does that mean? We are going to estimate the line, the curve. It's going to calculate that by bringing the curve through all these points. As we can see, in this case, it starts at a corner point or a hard node. And we're going through all these continuous curve points, meaning the curve will, if you alter something through a curve point, when you alter something on one side of the curve, it goes back through the previous node and edits that line too. It allows those lines all to bend through those continuous curve lines. And then you're going to see there are some cusp lines, and those cusp points, when we hit a cusp, and we see that down here too, was in Stitch Artist, you're going to see these represented as a point with a vertical line through it, a cusp. That means you can come into that point and exit that point either in a curve or a line, but it's a corner. It allows the line to break. When we edit something on one side of a cusp, on the other side, the line's not going to move. When we drag or mess with the curve, on the other side, it's not going to move. And then we have here hard points or corner points. The line that goes into a corner point in Stitch Artist is going to be represented by a square node. The line that goes into a corner point is straight. It is a straight line from the previous line directly to that line or corner node. And whatever we do, it's always going to be straight. You can't bend it. It's not a curve. And I often use these at the ends of satin stitches or when I crop a fill stitch off, because I want to not have it recalculating any more stitches up into that curve. Often that end line is going to represent the stitch angle at the end of my satin stitch column. But if we look at this Bezier over here, these are really very similar shapes. What you're going to see in the Bezier over here on the right, like I said, we have our first, once again, I'll point these out. That's our line node, which is a little square, a little harder to see. We have a cusp node in here, and we have these continuous curve nodes throughout that are represented by these circles. But in this case, you're going to see on this Bezier, we have our hard corner node, our line node. So we have a line going to this point, the selected node. And then we have these other continuous curve nodes that are kind of at what we call prime point placement. They're at this point, just kind of the apex of the curve. So we can just allow this one point and these handles that you see stretching out from the points to define those curves. And we stretch these handles, and the further away they are from the center, drags that, kind of bends the line toward that curve. And then the angle of this line changes how that curve is going to look, the character of the curve. And in this case, you can see we only have very few points, but we're still defining the same curvature that we have through the spline. The interesting thing about spline versus Bezier as a drawing tool, splines, if we want to get closer to the curve, we add more points. And as we add more points along our intended curve, computer is recalculating those points and trying to get the curve to more closely match a line that would naturally flow through all those curved points, right? That's what we're doing here on the spline. Whereas on a Bezier, We are either clicking and dragging and placing these lines and handles as we go, or we're doing what I often kind of say it's the most trust the process version of drawing that you can do, and that's where I call it clicking the corners. We go ahead and place at the end points, any corner point, we place a hard node or a cusp node, depending on whether we're coming from a curve or not. At the kind of these furthest points out, this kind of apogee of the curve, I will be placing a continuous curve node. And then as we go through, I can come back and edit them. So it's a draw as you go versus placing it. Draw as you go, and we drag the lines each time as we go through to get them kind of where we want them. Or you place and edit, you say, where there's a corner, I put a corner node. Where there's a curve, I put a curve. Where there's a cusp, I put a cusp. And then I'm going to come back around and shape that line into the way I want it. Both of those are fully viable ways to do this. Neither of them are bad. And it really doesn't matter. It's about what's more comfortable for you. But so, like I said, Spline versus Bezier here. Splines are definitely the default for most digitizing software and traditional tools. Line's going to flow through the nodes and it approximates the curve. Bezier is usually the default for vector software and some vector style tools in digitizing software. Line does flow through the nodes, but it's controlled by the handles that extend from each node. Like I said earlier, spline, you want to fit curves more closely, you add more nodes. Bezier, you want to precisely position those nodes in the places they should be to help you get the curve where it needs to be. Like I said, off at those kind of apogee of the curve, at the top corners of the curve, if you want to call it that, and then alter the angle and the distance of the handles to get the shape where you want it. And there's also different sorts of lines and curves. Straight line for spline drawing only requires 2 nodes to draw with a spline-based tool. But the thing to remember, and this is what gets people very confused, especially depending on how your software previews a line, to define a curve, you need 3 points. Why? In the case of especially a spline, if we're not doing this with Bezier, we're doing it with a spline, from one point to a second point, no matter what that node is. Now, in this case, we're showing these with stitch artist style nodes. This is a line node, this is a continuous curve node, and this is a cusp node. Whatever these two are, if I only draw 2, the line cannot approximate anything except for a straight line between 2. When you're drawing with splines, where you're clicking along the line, you have to have at least 3 points to define a line, because we have a start point, we have a point that the curve passes through, and then we have something that ends the curve, or at least it continues the curve on. And you will not see this curve in all softwares until that third point's placed. And there's lots of folks, if you are used to Bezier drawing, you could very well click here, click over here, and then drag your handle out to make a curvature between those two lines if this was a cusp like this, or a curve point. With cusp or a continuous curve point, we can have a curve that goes into it. Also, just to make this clear too, any line is going to be defined. Any segment of a line is defined by that point that it's going into, right? So if I'm going toward a corner or a line node, the line that I draw will be straight. If I'm going toward a curved node or a cusp node, it could be curved in that process. And especially if I do have 3 points like this and I'm using spline drawing and a curved node, it's going to make a curve that passes through that point in the center. But you don't define a line without 2 sides. You need to have 2 points to define any segment at all. And to get to a curve with spline drawing specifically, you need 3 points to get there. And so as you're drawing, you may not see your spline pop into being in the curve you expect it to until you get some points down the road. So even if you're doing spline drawing, which is fairly immediate as to showing the curves versus kind of drawing with Bezier curves and like placing points and editing them, as you draw with these points, you need to go ahead and trust the process and keep defining your curve before you freak out. If you only place 2 points, you won't have a curve unless you go back into a Bezier mode and edit and drag handles around. And in fact, honestly, for most generation, you probably want that center point anyway. But yeah, spline curves, they start with that one node, but they have to pass through one more before they end in order to make an actual curvature. Without putting too fine a point on it, there are different node models. I'm not going to go super deep into it. I talked about these different nodes. It's kind of like I talked about before as I showed it here. Some vector software has 3 nodes, some has 2. Some will even have other specialty node types for different stuff that they do to a line that's proprietary to whatever software that is, or at least locked down. Stitch Artist has a 3-node model. Wilcom has a 2-node model. Stitch Artist, you have a line node, which means only a line will ever come into it. We have a circular node here, a curve node, which means it's always a continuous curve through the line. And then we have this cusp node, and the cusp node I could then take off to another curvature or off to a line or anything else because it breaks the line at that point. That's something that is dependent. If you have a 2-node model, then the corner node is really defined by its position with other nodes. So you have a corner or a curve node, and that corner node is either a line or a cusp. It just depends on what's going into it from the previous segment. Not going to go deep into that, just to understand that that happens. The other kind of nodes you can have, it's one of those specialty nodes, symmetrical. It just means that it locks these handles together. So instead of me dragging one handle and being able to change half of a curvature off of one node, when I drag one handle, the other handle moves out the same way and is locked to it in distance. It's just a way of locking those together so that you can make kind of a more symmetrical curve when you're working on it. But it really depends on the software exactly how those nodes are used. But the stuff that is universal to understand is that despite the entry and despite the node types, when we want to use a drawing with points or a spline entry, that is always going to be something that has that kind of more points equals more continuity of the line. That is just how that's going to be. So if I'm drawing with points, I'll go ahead and pull up software just to show you. I've got another design that's here, but I'm just drawing where the design is. I'm not actually trying to show you the design itself in this particular piece. I'm going to go ahead and pull that up on my screen real quickly here. So this is a design that I have on my screen. It is not something I'm working on. But if I'm drawing with points here, I actually have my default point as a line point. That's just an old habit. Lots of folks have their default point to a curve. It probably makes more sense, but because I'm kind of stuck in the line point first, I went ahead and turned mine on to line point. In Stitch Artist, you can change that up here to curve point as your basis. Otherwise, you're holding down a modifier, and you can see next to my cursor, it might not be huge, but you'll see that the little indicator changes as to what kind of point that I'm using. But what we can see here is this. If I go from a line point to line point, that's a line. If I then add a curve point here, I need to add one more curve point, and then it's going to estimate my curve through that line. If I go into a cusp point, then I can start doing different stuff. I can then back up from here, make a new curve. I can change direction, what have you. Whereas if I did the same thing with all curve points, it wouldn't make that nice sharp point that you see here. It would then be a curve. So as you can see, the segment of the line is defined by the next point in the sequence. And if we have a curve that is continuous, it's going to be defined by 3 points. But this is spline style digitizing. If I want to get closer to a curve that I was trying to trace, and I don't have a traceable art here, but I would probably then just keep on putting more curves in, and I would get closer and closer to that kind of curve that I'm trying to do. And then if I was going to be, finished with that line and I want to go back and edit that, but this is not quite where the curve was supposed to be, I could add a point there and then I can work on it. Now I have my Bezier editing on here, and I can turn that back off to spline editing. And then the spline will just kind of mystically, magically, as I try and approximate my curve better, if I need to have more points, I can add more points and then drag that in, and it will just keep on estimating the curve. However, I'm just going to show you that you can change your editing, especially in Stitch Artist, is change back and forth quite easily. And then we can edit as if we were on Bezier curves. And once we're on Bezier curves, now you can see that I have these handles. And if I want to alter the nature of the curve, I can by altering the angle and the distance of the handles. And just to make a point about that, if I have a Bezier curve, now first I'm drawing with points. I'm not going to worry too much about how else I'm going to do this. But let's say if I have a Bezier curve and I draw this thing into a corner node, or a cusp node rather. So I've got my cusp node and I have just 2 points here, right? But if I have these 2 points and I'm going to edit this line, I now have this curve. I can make a curve with 2 points when I'm using Bezier because I have a handle that allows me to alter the curvature of that line. And because I have a cusp point here, I'm allowed to do that. That's what's defining the fact that I'm allowed to have a curve that runs into that cusp. And that's why people get confused. If you're drawing as Bezier, they may be more used to doing that. In fact, as you're drawing with a pen tool, then you can actually preset your Bezier curves as you go. Whereas I have a tendency to, even if I am drawing as Bezier, I'm going to likely set my points first and then work them out. And that's the funny thing is you can do that even if you're drawing in a spline mode first. I could still do prime point placement and say, let's imagine I'm on a new object here, and I can still say, go to what I call the clock points, 3, 6, 9, 12 around the clock. Imagining I have a clock in front of me. I can, in drawing a circle or an oval, still start over at these kind of prime points. And even though this won't look exactly like the line I probably want, I could place those in here and then go back in with my editing after this is done, and I can go back and then tweak and edit my position. Or let's say this was supposed to be a cusp, and I can also just change that after the fact. I could then go back and say, all right, this is a cusp. Now I'm going to go back and do this editing to make that shape whatever I want it. And I think that's just as viable as any other way of doing this. So you can do this in any of these different ways. Ultimately, drawing is about what's more comfortable to you. Most of the time, you're going to find that I'm drawing with points, but at the same time, if you look at these pieces that I'm working on here, though this was done with a fairly standard way of drawing for a satin column, you can notice that I don't have a ton of points around the outside edge on this satin stitch. If I were doing this in spline mode only, you would see far more points generally to try and approximate this curve, whereas I've used a lot of more vector style, Bezier style lines in this piece and done a lot of my editing in that Bezier format. Once again, not right or wrong. Almost all of my earlier work that I did previous to Stitch Artist, a lot of my Wilcom work is done because of the default nature of splines and the fact that Bezier editing is not something that's widely done or turned on. People aren't usually using Bezier editing. A lot of them have those splines, and a lot of my early work, a lot of the stuff you're seeing in front of you now, that work is often done with tons of points in complex curves, and there's nothing wrong with it. Letting the spline calculate for you is great. Nothing wrong with that. I like to use some pretty clean vector style art these days. Also because a lot of my work is being used by other people. And if they're on my working file, the one thing I will tell you about that, and we actually bring this back in, let's just go ahead and go to that, even though it's not perfectly done that way, the Raven design that we had earlier. And this is, it's a shield mount. So this is one of my other like historical Viking Age style pieces that's over here. Before you wonder, that's why I got all this goofy stuff here. But yeah, this is a little kind of historical Viking Age piece again. But if we imagine that someone else is having to work on my design, and let's say that they want to pull that curve out and make something a little thicker in one spot, if all they have to do is grab this line and drag it, then they can make some alterations to that curve pretty easily. Now, if this is something where, despite the fact that it's a pretty simple curve, I use spline style digitizing and I really dropped a fair number of spline points in here. Let's say they just want to change the thickness of this line a little bit. Let's say they grab the line. Well, okay, but I'm altering that and it's between the 2 points. Well, now I'm trying to grab this and I want to change this whole thing. Well, I'm kind of pulling it out in a weird shape, but this curvature didn't change here. Editing a piece that has tons of points like that, if we're doing a piece for a one-off that's not going to be repurposed, that's not going to be reused or added to or made thicker or dealt with or change the curvature of a piece, if we don't think that there's going to be editing or reuse, then tons of spline points are not going to bother you too much, right? It's not going to be a big deal. You can approximate the curve. It's really fast for digitizing. You'll find lots of professional digitizers are going to use those for one-off logos that aren't going to be edited or used as stock. But if there's something where you think somebody might want to make changes to it, or you yourself might want to make artistic changes to it, the ability to kind of play with this curve in a more fine way, the ability to click and drag on curved areas and get some really nice editing that maintains the kind of tangent coming out from the original handle. Vector style, Bezier style drawing is going to make that a little easier for you to handle. And then let's say, even if we were trying to make something that was drawn in a way be a little thicker just in one area like this, the editing is now a lot more smooth and potentially possible to do. Whereas if I had a ton of little curve points, I'm going to have to probably delete a bunch of that stuff out and then re-approximate that curve or redraw it with more spline points. It's not the only way it can be done. There's other stuff we can do to do some editing. I find that reworking stuff like this, or things like keyboard fonts, if you are digitizing a font for someone else to use that is rescalable, cleaner lines tend to win the day. You do want more points in some areas to help with stitch generation, but in general, cleaner lines for something that someone else is going to rescale, resize, or edit is going to be a better option for you if you're giving people working files. Now, that's not something that most people have to deal with. That is something that folks like me who make things that are going to be in your software and then get reused, resized, rescaled, warped, slammed into an envelope, what have you, we have some more concerns about that than maybe other digitizers do. But I will say, in reworking my own pieces, using kind of prime point placement and drawing more like a designer has made pieces nicer to edit down the road, even in artistic ways. So for me, I like to use the vector style input. The other thing I am going to be clear about, though, is you could, like you just saw me do, go back and forth. You could throw a ton of points at a curve, delete some of those out and correct your curve, and then go back and do the editing. It just means a little more correction ahead of time. So it's not impossible. It's just one of those things where if you draw nice, clean vector ahead of time, you're more likely to have usable, clean work throughout and have a better option for later when you're editing. Also, the other thing is, if you're ever going to take shapes back out of embroidery to do something else with them, not usually common because we draw really weird shapes to make stitches work out the way we want them to. If you're ever going to use some of those graphical operators and try and push stuff out, let's say we take a bunch of fills and elements and then slam them out to make a cut element from for applique. Let's say we're replacing a fill with an applique, something like that. Using fewer points makes that way cleaner for cutters and lasers. When you have tons of little points and you try and throw it to a color cutter, you'll see it jiggling around as it goes through all the points. Whereas if you use continuous curves, cutters, plotters, lasers, things like that can calculate those curves in a much nicer way. So things like cut files, if you used spline entry on some of those, occasionally you'll get output that's not as nice as if you used Bezier style entry. So I know that was kind of heavy. That's a lot of detail about that stuff, but hopefully it makes a little more sense to you. As far as Stitch Artist goes, which is where I'm primarily doing my work now, obviously, the entry with points and then the editing, you can swap back and forth and the line doesn't really change. Whereas there are some softwares and some elements where if you swap back and forth between Bezier and the spline style editing, you might see some variation in the shape, and you have to really watch for that when you're working on it. So it's just something to look at. But yeah, we have one comment about that, and then I'm gonna go ahead and close up the show. I think we've done enough like fully nerding out on node types and stuff right now. But let's grab this comment here from Identity Threads. Bezier fan here. I use spline once in a while, but one thing I can't get right is using a pen tool. That drives me crazy for some reason. I can't get it right. Yeah, I mean, it's weird. It's kind of an acquired taste for me because what's people don't really know about me is, despite the fact that I've been digitizing for so long, when I was in school, you guys know I was in school for medieval studies, so it's not like I was doing anything for medieval studies with this, but medieval studies in English, what I went to school for. But when I was in school, I also drew stuff, and I was kind of into digital art a little bit as a dabbler, as somebody who's trying to do fun stuff. Also because as you saw from the little Viking pieces I still make to this day, some of the historical stuff I was interested in really wasn't represented in drawings that I could use for my papers, or if I wanted to decorate something for, we had a medieval studies group that I did. If I wanted to make something for that, I didn't have a lot of options. So I bought myself a really, way back in the day, very old CD version of Corel Draw. I think it might have been 10 at the time. I can't remember how old this sucker was. Probably a little earlier, might have been 9. I don't remember, but I drew in Corel Draw before I ever did art for anything else. And I did that largely for my kind of medievalist hobby, to put it that way. I mean, yes, I went and got a degree, but at the time, me studying kind of pre-Christian Scandinavia, Germanic stuff, Viking stuff, there weren't a lot of options as far as art for these things. And so if I wanted to make cool art for these things, I had to make it myself. I had to draw based on photographs that were available largely in print. And when I did that, I learned how to do some vector drawing. Also, what you guys probably don't know about me is, despite the fact that most of my work has been embroidery, I've done lots of vehicle stuff, stickers for windows, and I've done store display and window fronts done out of cut vinyl, to the point where at our old office, I did that for Brighton Leap, the folks who make Brilliance. I made a window cut for that at one point and applied it to our storefront glass door. That is something I used to do. So I've done lots of cutting as well as applique and everything else related to embroidery. But you have to have very clean, nice vector for cutters to behave, depending on what you're working on. And you really have to simplify that. And your paths have to be nice. They need to be clean. They need to be well made. So when I transitioned into digitizing in a Bezier method more often, I went to it pretty readily, but there are some folks who don't. Whereas I know there's lots of folks who go to Bezier drawing because they start in Illustrator, they start in CorelDRAW, they start now in Affinity. And when they go into drawing for splines, it's a little weird. Though I'm going to tell you guys, whereas we used to see the concept of drawing in spline, especially those of us who build Wilcom digitizers, which I was for most of my career. I mean, I've used also, guys, you guys know I've used Pulse and Design Shop and QDT, of course, way back in the day. I've used every manner of tool for digitizing and tens that I won't mention, Sierra. If you've had it out there for digitizing, I've touched it at one point, and I've used many of them for long periods of time. But spline was really kind of the default, and you did spline points for embroidery. That is just how it was. I don't think that's necessarily the case. And also, you never saw spline entry being used as much for graphic software. But recently, I saw somebody talking about a special mode in Affinity, and what it turned out to be was spline drawing. It was like, oh, smart lines, smart nodes. I can't remember. I think that's what it was called. I'll have to look it up again. But it was a drawing method in Affinity Designer, which is a full vector software tool, and it was spline drawing added back to it. And I know that Inkscape, also the free open source vector tool that's out there, I've used it for quite some time, but I haven't used it in a while now, also has a spline drawing mode. So the ease of splines does make a lot of sense to folks. It means not playing with these fiddly handles, which can be difficult for people, especially if they do the draw as you go method instead of placing points and editing. Bezier can be pretty finicky, and if you're not ready for it, I do find people have trouble with Bezier when they first start. If you are a Bezier baby, you have started out your drawing career in software that uses Bezier first. If you were a vector artist for print or for digital, or like me, you did sign vinyl or cutting or laser or any of that stuff, the chances are you'll feel comfortable with Bezier, and it will be something you might want to work in. What I would encourage everybody to do is try the different methods in your software, see what works best for you. And I find even to the point of my entry tools can make differences to me. I like to enter with spline and then edit with the mouse most of the time. When I do, I rarely do use pen tablets, but when I do use pen tablets, I find sometimes I do draw as I go, or if I'm doing something organic, I'll go full spline, because I'm often doing something very organic where the preciseness of the line isn't as important as to where the stitches land, and I'm just going to drag those lines until I get what I want. So is there something better or worse about these tools? No. Can you draw any of these things without punching out or using path operations? Absolutely, you can. But it can be worthwhile. So if you're out there, you're looking for something to save you some time, think about it. Try out the path operations. If you're in Stitch Artist, they're up here in the corner. Depending on your configuration, if you are in Wilcom, they might be somewhere else, but you will see something like this in most tools, where you see these shadows of little shapes that are overlapping each other. If you see that somewhere in a tool, you know that you're probably looking at a path operations or pathfinder window, or a toolbar that has that going on. It's worthwhile to try them out and see what they do. Especially if you are doing anything that is not embroidery, where that having those perfect kiss cut lines doesn't cause problems. Vector drawing for any other operation, it can be done that way without really worrying too much about it. And especially for cutting can be quite nice. We want a perfect kerf width cut on something where it just matches, then that's exactly how you want it. You would want to flatten and smash stuff down. But like I said, for big, simple borders over shapes, path operations can be very nice. And like I showed you earlier, even though there was editing to be done on it, the concept of using these sacrificial shapes to create things like this is really nice. Or when you have two pieces that are going together and you just want to eliminate some of the bulk out of it, it doesn't take long, despite the fact that I said people sometimes forget to look into the kind of nature of the stitch when we're talking about the ends of these points. It's not like it takes a million years to drop another point on there and make a chisel ending to that piece that has a flat line. This still can be useful for making these big sweeping curves that you're not really wanting to recreate. And then you drop a couple of points at the end and cut that line off with the stitch angle so that we get really nice, clean generation down to the end of the line and control how small our stitches try to generate. That's still worthwhile to do, and it can still save you tons of drawing time. So the concept of those sacrificial shapes is one that actually is pretty useful, depending on what kind of work you're doing. All right, folks, I was going to go short and I went long, as I often do, but I'm going to go ahead and let you guys go. What I would say is, if you haven't tried one method or the other, go out there and play around. If you really have trouble with Bezier graphics, the other cool thing is, because vector software all uses it, there are cool things like the Bezier game that's out there. I should have grabbed you guys a link, but I didn't think about it ahead of time. There are games and software tools and all of these various ways to teach you how to draw Bezier curves. And frankly, the way that those curves work mathematically is very similar across all these softwares. If you learn how to handle the handles in one of those softwares or games, you're going to be able to learn the other ones pretty readily. And if nothing else, get into your software, get into your favorite suite when you have some time and just play. Push the buttons, drive it like you own it. Drive it like you stole it. It is your software to use, and those buttons are there for you. And if you make a new design and put some shapes on it and you beat it up and things break, fine. It's not the end of the world. Failure is not fatal. Nobody's watching you do it. I mean, dance like no one's watching, folks. Well, you can draw like no one's watching too. Try it out, see what happens, and see what works for you. Ultimately, the end result of digitizing is this stitch out. Embroidery is our goal, not the file. Find what works for you and make that method yours. But get out there, try it, and I can't wait to see what you make next week.